Welcome to 2021 Sunstone Symposium Session 374, the all-male draft, male priesthood, conscription, and the effects of mandatory ordination and in contemporary Mormon theology. At Sunstone, we're making it a goal to build a community that allows many ways for people to express their faith. Our tagline is, there's more than one way to Mormon. We invite you to help us build a community where all paths are given space to be better understood. Please support us in our mission by making a donation and subscribing at sunstone.org. After the symposium, Sunstone staff will edit, polish, and re-upload all of this year's session videos to the Huva app. It'll take about 2 weeks for everything to be available, but once it is, every video will be available to watch and rewatch in the Huva app through the end of 2021. Please type any questions into the Huva app to be addressed during the Q&A. Or if you're watching in person, we'll open the audience mic for questions at the end as time allows. About this presentation, in a time when many women are clamoring for ordination, are there men who would prefer to opt out? Although women are prohibited from ordination in the LDS Church, men are effectively required to be ordained in order to participate as a full-fledged member, hold standing, obtain exalting ordinances in the temple, and progress toward heaven. But that requires a theology that exacts clear expectation differences from men than women. If it was never required anciently, where does this requirement come from? And why does it persist in contemporary LDS practice? What would it mean to let it go? I'll take a second to introduce you to our speaker before we begin. Ian Thomson is a criminal defense attorney in Boise, Idaho, and is a graduate of the University of Chicago and BYU Law School. His religious interests range from early Christian Gnosticism to social justice and politics in the LDS Church. I'll give the floor to Ian.
Hey, thank you so much. So we have this language that we run on frequently, right? About the armies of Helaman or warriors or whatever it is, right? And I've thought for several years about this analogy about conscription and how the priesthood is sort of like calling men off to battle or war. And I wanted to use this opportunity to sort of explore this idea. You know, when I chose the title of this, I knew that there was a Supreme Court challenge being made to the all-male draft. Now, most of you probably didn't know this because they punted 2 months ago. And I thought, man, by the end of July, this is going to be a national topic of conversation. It's going to be huge. It's going to be poignant. We can make this extension. But 40 years ago, the all-male draft was challenged as sex discrimination in this country. And an all-male, just a few months before Sandra Day O'Connor took the bench, an all-male US Supreme Court upheld that it was not gender discrimination because we discriminated against women, was the rationale, because they weren't allowed to serve in combat. And so the rationale is, because we're discriminatory, we're going to be discriminatory, right? And that was the holding in Rosker versus Goldberg. This year, there's a new challenge that was made, National Coalition of Men versus Selective Service Administration. Women can now serve everywhere in the military, including on a front line in a foxhole, that men can't. And so the rationale in 1981 no longer holds. And they're like, well, then we better start drafting women. Or the way we set up the selective service is gender discrimination. Well, at the end of June, they issued an opinion that basically said, we are not going to rule on this case because Congress has a current proposal on a 3-year study out of the Pentagon that is recommending to them to do away with the male draft. And so we're actually going to give Congress some time to make the right call and solve this problem politically before we wade in. This whole topic reminds me of the now late Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and because she was one of the great advocates in the 70s for women's rights, right? She, not a Supreme Court justice, she was an attorney at the time. And she, as a single attorney, may have done more for gender discrimination than any other attorney in the country. But, you know, of her 5 cases that went well, I may get these numbers wrong, but of the 5 primary cases went to the US Supreme Court, 4 of them, her plaintiffs were men. And she was convinced that if I'm going to make things right for women, I've got to make men feel it, right? And so I've got to go after the points at which they feel discriminated against, an all-male Supreme Court. And so strategically, just like the NAACP had done 30 or 40 years ago, strategically pick your plaintiffs that are the most sympathetic to an all-male, all-white at that time, Supreme Court. And Time magazine, in writing up about her, she says, by turning the tables and arguing gender equality on behalf of male plaintiffs, it wasn't reverse psychology on her part. It was simply a patient strategy. And I wonder if we're interested in an ungendered priesthood, if we need a different patient strategy. In other words, if you're going to make a challenge, consider coming from the other direction. There's obvious observations about priesthood, a priesthood of all men, right? In recent years, I have a picture in the background there of some of the ordained women organization. Mormonism has seen this increased demand, not across the board, but amongst some women that, why can't women be ordained to the priesthood? Or asking why women may not be ordained, at least, if they're not advocating for an admission into the priesthood. Well, can you at least explain what the rationale is? And this has precipitated, I believe, in the last 10 years, if we listen to General Conference, has precipitated a popular revisitation in the theology, trying to explain what is the priesthood. And we have several talks in the last, well, basically since Ordained Women, trying to develop, I say trying to develop because my whole presentation is they're not very successful, right? They're trying to develop a theology that will explain to us what is the priesthood and in what sense women have the authority of the priesthood and use the priesthood, even if they're not ordained. But there's a not so obvious question here that I'm the only one I've ever heard ask it, honestly, and I've fished around it quite a bit. My experience is that the majority of active Mormon women that I speak with do not want the priesthood. But if there are women in the church who want the priesthood, possibly only a minority, maybe even a small minority, is there a corresponding camp of men in the church who do not want the priesthood, even if it's small? We don't know, because nobody's ever asked. Men are never asked this question, right? They're universally ordained. And now, at 11, you're conscripting little boys into an army, right? An army of Helaman, before they're in any capacity to make serious covenants about what this will entail for the rest of their life. But it's a little more serious than that, right? It's not just we're going to conscript you into service. It is if you want to participate in our community as a man, not as a priesthood holder, not as a bishop, not as a leader. I just mean as a man. We require you to come through the priesthood. So let me just spend 2 minutes, 5 minutes on background that I don't think anything that's going to be controversial, okay? But this is important to remind ourselves. Priesthood in the Old Testament, we know was exclusive, okay? I mean, go ahead and make an alternate argument, but it's going to be difficult. It was either through the patriarchal structure, or it was literally through a tribe, meaning 1 of 12. 1 of 12. We're talking about 7%. If, that's actually not how the percentage exactly worked out. But 1 tribe got the priesthood. And there's possible non-lineal priesthoods, that predated, and I'm talking about a literalistic Old Testament, right? But this is our theology. That predated the time of Aaron. There was clearly a non-tribal priesthood. But we know it wasn't everybody. I mean, we have stories in the Old Testament about this. It wasn't everybody. You had to go out and seek a priest, right? You had to take your sacrifices to the priest. Even Melchizedek, right, was known as this great high priest. Priesthood in the New Testament, again, it was the time of the Jews. Like, don't make an argument to me that everybody had the priesthood. It was clear that he called specific disciples. It wasn't the 5,000 that were participating in the Sermon on the Mount. It was a few. Even if you believe that he gave an actual priesthood to his disciples, it was a few. And then as we go through the time of Paul in the first century or whatever, we're told that he made some apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors, some teachers. It was clearly just a few. And then we have these confusing scriptures, right, in Romans, where he's calling Sister Phoebe a deacon and Junia one of the apostles. Whatever your explanation is going to be, don't try and superimpose a Mormon framework of the priesthood onto the first century, okay? And I don't want to get into the history, but this is the background. The point being, if we go to the Book of Mormon, it's the same thing. There's no indication that there was a universal ordination of every male. Of course, pre-Christ, we believe that they were coming out of the tribes, right? And although they weren't of Levi, there has to be some explanation as to where in the world they got off thinking that they could ordain one another out of the tribe of Joseph, right? But they did. And one of these non-lineal priesthoods, we see it passed down through patriarchy. But again, every once in a while, it's like, yeah, my son's not good enough, I'm going to pick him, right? And then we have people like Alma, who almost self-ordains. At least that's how I read it. But Jacob and Joseph were consecrated as priests and teachers. It's very interesting to read through the Book of Mormon looking for priesthood as opposed to offices, because it's not there, right? Only in Alma do we ever see a discussion of the priesthood with regard to high priests. But we do talk about elders, disciples, apostles, priests, and teachers as offices. And again, if you're interested in that, there's plenty that's been written on this before. But there's an emphasis on the office, not on the priesthood, right? The power of the priesthood. And then my favorite scriptures in Moroni, right? The first 5 chapters of Moroni. Moroni clearly has a different idea. At least he's using very different language, because there is no priesthood. It's the power of the Holy Ghost. It's the power of the Spirit by which we baptize. It's the power of the Spirit by which we're sanctified. It's the power of the Holy Ghost by which we organize our meetings. It's by the power of the Holy Ghost that even the teachers and deacons, or I'm sorry, the priests and teachers administer what we would call ordinances. Universal ordination, I don't think it's controversial to say, cannot be found anywhere in Mormon scripture outside of the current dispensation, post 1830. So if the priesthood were essential, right, if it were necessary, some evidence of its universality would be present in other times. Otherwise, you have to fall back on this idea that, well, in work for the dead in our temples, we're ordaining every single man, right, to the Melchizedek priesthood. And women may not even be aware of this because it's not something you participate in. But I've certainly sat there on an elevated table out next to the baptistry and ordained each other 100 times, right? So we are doing that, meaning every man, the blue list and the pink list on the names, the name cards, there's an ordination on the blue cards that isn't on the female cards. But if the priesthood were so necessary, why would it be so rare in the past? If it were so necessary to our salvation and exaltation, why would it be so exclusive? It only becomes universal in 1830. And when I started doing my reading, I was like, I bet this was a slow release, right? It took them up until 1835, 1836, right, with the revelation of the priesthood before they started really ordaining. No, it's not true. They were ordaining every man basically from 1829. At least that's the history. And so it was started off from the get-go, right? You got baptized and you were ordained to an office. right? Not to the priesthood. So you were made a teacher, a priest, or an elder as early as 1829. And again, those 9 named offices, I'm going to forget one if I try and do it, but deacon, teacher, priest, bishop, elder, high priest, apostle, 70, patriarch. Those really didn't crystallize until 6 years later, right? 1835, 1836. But priesthood in that first generation of the LDS Church, they were acting in virtue of their office. At least that's how it reads, right? Not in virtue of the priesthood. I act as an elder in the church. I act as a deacon, not by the power of the holy Melchizedek priesthood, which I hold. And the 9 offices of the LDS Church were in place by 1835. The ages, it's mostly adults, right? But there were some young men being ordained before 1877. And then by 1877, well into the Utah period, then we see this universal ordination of youth. The conferral, right? So now we confer either the Aaronic priesthood when you become a deacon, or you confer the Melchizedek priesthood when you become an elder. So the first office that you hold in either priesthood, you're conferred. This is the current handbook, right? You're conferred the priesthood and then ordained to an office. But this conferral language, we're giving you possession of a power, and then we're going to designate which office under that power you can operate, is new. I mean, relatively new. Halfway into the history of our church. There was no conferral before about 1900. And then this was one of the pet projects of Joseph F. Smith, apparently, who began to advocate a conferral right, as he publishes in Gospel Doctrine, as his understanding of Doctrine and Covenants 107. And then, of course, his acolytes, Joseph Fielding Smith and Bruce R. McConkie, pushed the conferral idea in Mormon doctrine in 1958. And for the first time, the church handbook begins requiring that we confer the priesthood to the holders of the priesthood in 1960. And this is important because this whole project is trying to distinguish what in the world are we doing through our office in the priesthood, and what are we doing by a generalized, vague cloak of the priesthood, right? This conferral of some essence or power. And then I've got a slide in here. Most of us know about when we talk about conscription, why are we conscripting young men? I mean, at 12 or now 11. The ages have changed over the years, right? And our current quorums, I think many of you who have read Mormon history will be aware that this really didn't happen until the first decade. But in about 1906, the church established a general priesthood committee, and they were charged with writing manuals for the church. And as they started talking about this, they were like, well, we really need to know who our audience is in order to write the manuals. Like, how old are we talking about? And like, we don't know. Well, we need to kind of universalize this, right? So when we write a deacon's manual, it's for young kids. And when we write a teacher's manual, it's for teenagers, et cetera, et cetera. So you can see sort of how those ages have changed over the years. And now we're down to 11, 13, and 15. And I think that's really interesting because when we talk about conscription, at least let the kids grow up, right? I mean, it's just like youth baptism. I mean, it really doesn't allow for an opportunity for that person, that developing person, to make a choice. Is this something that I want? It's just part of the covenant path, or whatever you want to call it. It has to happen. It has to happen because it's really important that people understand a man cannot progress in the church. And when I say in the church, I mean in the plan of salvation, in the gospel, returning to heaven without the priesthood. That's how it is currently. A young man's or an adult's progress in the church is stunted or curtailed if they're not ordained. You cannot receive an initiatory or an endowment or be sealed to your spouse if you don't have the priesthood. Not true of women. So if there was a man, for whatever reason, I run across this sometimes in the groups that I participate in, that basically say, hey, I'm actually not going to ordain my 11-year-old. I would like him to grow, get a little older, think about it, make a decision on his own. A 15-year-old who's unordained can't get a temple recommend to do a proxy baptism with the 15-year-old girl who's not ordained. She can go, he cannot. They won't be able to go back to heaven without the priesthood, but just one gender. But it's important that a man's position in the church is not tied to maleness, because this is the critique that comes from patriarchy, and that's fine. It's a shorthand, right? But it's not his maleness. It's his possession of priesthood, which happens to be almost every man in the church, right? But you can find a couple examples, right, of the delayed unordained young man, or more interestingly, somebody who has been readmitted to the church after excommunication and their priesthood has not yet been restored, right? That is a member of the church, adult male, without the priesthood. And generally, most stake presents are going to require a considerable delay before that man obtains them. Well, it's usually reobtains, right? It's a restoration of the priesthood, not a new conference of the priesthood. And that person is in pardon the pun, a no man's land, right? Without the priesthood, a man's total disenfranchisement follows, total. And my argument has always been, if there's one person more disenfranchised in the LDS Church than a woman, it's an unordained man. You have no home. You don't belong to a quorum. You don't belong to a society. You don't belong to an auxiliary, right? You're stateless. That's not true of women. You cannot progress. You cannot obtain the initiatory. You cannot be promised to be a priest and a king in heaven. You cannot receive your endowment. You cannot be sealed to your spouse or your children. You can be sealed to your parents. Not true of women. Your service is limited. You can't serve a mission. A woman serves a mission without the priesthood, or any of the many male-oriented callings, male-specific callings in the handbook. They are restricted or reserved for men with the priesthood. Not always temple recommend holding, but always the priesthood. Not true of women. And you're powerless. You have absolutely no opportunity to ever preside, no leadership calling, never in a position of decision-making. And this, unfortunately, is true of women, but to a lesser extent, because we have auxiliaries at least. You could at least sit on I know this is crumbs, but you could at least sit on a ward council, right? Your voice could at least be heard. Not true of an unordained man. What does this all mean? Who cares? Because the fact is, all men can get it. So why are you, kvetching? Why are you complaining? We're not keeping men from the priesthood. Well, I'm curious because I'm interested, why do I need the priesthood to get back to heaven? What is it about it that I need, right? As a male, as a man. And so I think we have to stop and explore a little bit what this means. And I think there's basically two theological approaches that you can take that are consistent. The first would be, we've heard this, right, for centuries. Only men are really deserving. It's only men who are capable of holding the priesthood. Only men can be trusted, meaning men are just better than women. And that's why they get the priesthood, right? God's a man. It said all the apostles are men, et cetera, et cetera. Most of us in this audience are old enough to have lived through that and heard it, right, in our lifetimes. However, it's become quite disfavored. That's unpopular and unpalatable, actually, to the brethren, right? They will not talk this way anymore. You will never hear that, I don't believe, from a general conference pulpit again. And they'll take quite a bit of care to avoid that type of language. But if it's not male chauvinism, men are just better than women, then doesn't it mean that priesthood is filling some sort of a gap or a handicap, meeting a deficit in order to get men back to where women can go, which is celestial kingdom or godhood or whatever. Because women don't need it. Women wouldn't benefit from possessing it, like the ordination. Women can progress without it. And women must have something else unavailable to men, like motherhood, or what we've heard this equivalence, right? So it's either men are better or men are worse. Because otherwise, why are we tying it to gender, right? So let's set aside for a minute two things, which is really important. Let's set aside the need to perform ordinances. Let's just say, for whatever reason, the ordination of priesthood through the proper power and authority is required, right? A lot of churches have this. Let's just say the performance of ordinances and the administration of a church, the conducting of meetings or whatever, requires priesthood. Well, that only takes a few people. It doesn't take half your congregation, okay? So let's just set that aside because most churches have dealt with this. You have a preacher, you have a pastor, you have a priest, you have a deacon. You have these folks that do your sacrament, perform your ordinances, baptize, right? If we set that aside and say, okay, there's going to be, every congregation, every group is going to need somebody that could baptize somebody that wants to come in. But if we just need that person, then the question is, what then is the actual effect that we believe possessing the priesthood has on every man as an entire class? So this is where I want to spend 10 or 15 minutes because I go back and I look and I say, please, brethren, explain to me, enlighten me what it is about my maleness that requires this dovetailing of the priesthood that allows me, because of my gonads or however you want to define gender or sex, requires this ordination in order for me to move on. And this is what I find. Elder Oaks, gender is eternal and essential to God's plan. He explains the plan to me in this talk, Truth in the Plan, from October of 2018. And he talks about how we're all born into mortality, receive a physical body. There's an opportunity to progress. We make meaningful choices between good and evil. We have an opportunity to overcome sin, et cetera, et cetera. I read all this about the plan of salvation, totally gender neutral. He talks about exaltation and returning to God's house, totally gender neutral. Boom, men and women. Boom, men and women. Boom, men and women. Boom, men and women. So what's so gender essential about the plan? Because your steps, as you summarized it, have nothing to do with gender. He turns to eternal truths and he says, our knowledge of God's revealed, everything in italics is a lifted quote, okay, direct quote. Our knowledge of God's revealed plan of salvation requires us to oppose pressures to homogenize the differences between men and women. We know that the relationships identities and functions of men and women are essential to accomplish God's great plan. Elder Oaks, you've got my attention. What is it? No, that's the end of the paragraph. It's an assertion, right? He goes on later on, 2 paragraphs later. Maleness and femaleness, marriage between a man and a woman, and the bearing and nurturing of children are all essential to his great plan of happiness. You've got my attention. How? No, that's just the end. That was his explanation of the theology. There is an infantilization of women in the church sometimes, right? I think most of us will agree with that. There's also a laymanization of men in the church. Get a load of this. This is 2006. Let us be men. Basically, a talk titled "Man Up," right? Be a man. Elder Christofferson has he opens up with an a very common view of an ordinary man, and it's layman named Lemuel, who acted like children. They murmured and complained. They didn't accept others' authority to correct them. They didn't value spiritual things. They easily resorted to violence. They were good at playing the victim. This is the man that you meet on the street. These men act as if man's highest goal should be his own pleasure. They dodge commitments. Dodging commitments is considered smart. Life of work and achievement is optional. These young men, he said, are stuck in neutral. This is all the big setup. We who hold the priesthood of God cannot afford to be this type of man. The drift. We, I'm assuming he's talking about priesthood holders, have work to do. We must arise from the dust of self-indulgence and be men. Right? This is something, a charge that we have only as men because we suck. Right? Men suck without the priesthood. And I know this isn't just a comment on general human condition, right? Because he says, to wrap up the talk, everywhere I have been impressed with the faith and capacity of our women, including some of the very young. So many of them possess a remarkable faith and goodness. They know the scriptures. They are poised and confident. I ask myself, do we have men to match these women? He talks about steps to being a man. What does it require for us to get out of this, ditch of self-indulgence and inability to make commitments? Well, we have to be a man in the priesthood. That means developing integrity, making sacrifices and honoring commitments, displaying obedience, doing good, opposing evil and error. Wow, that stuff is fascinating. That's a great list, right? For discipleship. True of women, no. They need to develop integrity, surely. They need to make sacrifices and honor commitments. Surely we can have a discussion about obedience, but if it's going to make your list, sure, they need to learn to obey. They need to do good. They need to oppose evil and error. What is gendered about this list? And it's a talk called Let Us Be Men. So our current president, priesthood enables men to serve and act like disciples. That's great. That's great. It's an avenue for service and discipleship. He says, to all brethren holding the priest, and this is from April of 2018, right? This is more recent. To all brethren holding the priesthood, I invite you to inspire members to keep their covenants. Fast and pray, study the scriptures, worship in the temple, and serve with faith. And then he throws this in as men and women of God. Okay. I thought we were talking about holding the priesthood, but okay. That's good. Maybe that's a lurch in that direction. But then he says, some of our brethren act like they do not understand what the priesthood is and what it enables them to do. And then he goes on this talk, basically exploring two things. How men don't understand that they have the power to give blessings as opposed to just prayers, and that they can minister to individual children of God and their families. I'll come back to that in a second. He says, we see faithful women who understand the power inherent in their callings and in their endowment and other temple ordinances. We see these faithful women, right? These women of the church without ordination know how to call upon the power of heaven to protect and strengthen their husbands, their children, and others they love. They know how to call upon the powers of heaven? I thought that's what priesthood was. These spiritually strong women who lead, teach, and minister fearlessly in their callings with the power and authority of God. All right, now we're talking, President Nelson, right? Okay, this is like the power of God to teach, to minister, to act in the name of God. But he's talking exclusively about women. And then he turns and he says, likewise, we see faithful men who live up to their privileges as bearers of the priesthood. The implication is if they didn't have the priesthood, they couldn't do it. They lead and serve by sacrificing the Lord's way with love, kindness, and patience. They bless, guide, protect, and strengthen others by the powers of the priesthood they hold. He can't be talking about ordination because he just gave us the exact same list for women above without ordination. He's saying that they strengthen and teach and protect through the authority of God. And men do basically the same thing. They bless, they guide, they protect through their ordination of the priesthood. One has it inherent, right? All these women walking around with the power and authority of God, like it's born, it's innate. And men get it at 11, right? When they get their hands laid upon. I mean, I just don't this is an honest question. I don't understand what's going on. I don't understand what's being preached, because he sits and relates a story in this same talk about ministering to and reactivating a brother years ago who later became a stake president, a mission president, temple president, and then he ordains him in a patriarch down in Sanpete County 30 years later, and it's beautiful. What is this all about? Why does this require priesthood? It started over a conversation that he had with this gentleman who was inactive in Boston, back in the 50s, over amateur radio equipment. A conversation, a friendship, a brotherhood. There's no laying on of hands. There was no declaration by the power of the Melchizedek priesthood that I hold in order to reactivate this brother. He's just described ministering, which both men and women could do. There are doors we can open, priesthood blessings we can give, hearts we can heal, burdens we can lift, testimonies we can strengthen, lives we can save, and joy we can bring into the homes of the Latter-day Saints, all because we hold the priesthood of God. The talk is entitled Ministering with the Power and Authority of God, but the stuff he talks about, other than, I guess, blessings, I mean, he does feel very strongly about blessings. Most of what he's talking about is discipleship, is loving people, is forming meaningful relationships, strengthening people, supporting them, ministering to them. How does this require holding the priesthood, right? And if it does, why do women do it and men can't without it? We move on to the third member of the First Presidency, Elder Eyring, who gave a talk back in April 2014 in the priesthood session called The Priesthood Man. Talk about definitive, right? The Priesthood Man. And he talks about the three common characteristics of heroic priesthood heroes of his. Well, they have a pattern of prayer. They have a habit of service. And they're remarkably honest. All great things, right? Why do we think that requires the priesthood? Like the ordination of the priest. I keep talking, I'm distinguishing ordination of the priesthood. And he says at the end, kind of wrapping up, my counsel to you, and remember he's speaking to a priesthood audience, my counsel to you who want to bless others. We've already been told that women are remarkable at blessing others, right? But you who want to bless others with your priesthood, this power that you have, has to do with your life, which is private to all but God. He wants us to pray to God, to thank God, ask God to know what individuals he has placed in our way for us to serve, plead that he will help us give that service, pray so that we can forgive that person, then serve them, then love them, and then forgive them. Again, I have no problem with this talk. I think it's a lot of it is beautiful, right? Good counsel. But can women do it? Can a woman pray to him? Can a woman thank him? Can a woman ask him what individuals he has placed in your way to serve? Plead, pray, serve, love, forgive. These are things that we expect a disciple of Christ to do upon baptism, man or woman. And he's doing his best to describe the priesthood man, right? Take that title off, and it's the Mormon one, the exact same talk. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, right? You can read a remarkable whole book about it, women in the priesthood. But we know that there's a strain. I just wanted to throw this out as a consideration, right? That within Mormon circles, theologically, there have been attempts to equate priesthood with motherhood. Women, basically if you talk about gender essentialism, the way that Elder Oaks talks about it, women possess the ability to foster the creation of life, right, in their bodies. Something a man can't do, that's fine. Meaning that's not controversial either. But if if this is the mirror or the counterpart to priesthood, and I'm taking them seriously, right? If this is your offering of the counterpart to priesthood, what does this mean when a large number of women in this life don't participate in the act of motherhood? Doesn't that mean that there's a large percentage of men? Yeah, I mean, remarkably, Sherry Dew herself, right? Who is now beyond childbearing years. Is this a possible analogy as to how we could have a remarkable number of men not participate in the priesthood in this sense and still be fine? I mean, it's not theologically inconsistent, right? And you always, I've heard these talks given, oh, I understand you can't be a mother, but you can be a mother in other ways, right? It doesn't require the birthing. Well, let me priesthood in other ways. I mean, if that's the case, I can be a figurative priest then. And I really think it's time to get serious about this, about the theology. Is there a cloak of the priesthood that men have to don in order to make up for some handicap or deficit that they suffer? And I really want my talk to manage expectations. I don't have a proposal. I just want a discussion to begin around what is the priesthood power, because the brethren want it both ways, right? What about the priesthood enables men to overcome the natural spiritual deficit or handicap that they must possess because they need it and women don't? If there isn't a male deficit, then why is the priesthood gendered? What about the male gender requires additional covenants and commitments? Because we talk about it's in the D&C, right? The priesthood covenants. When we conscript an 11-year-old, it's not just, oh, we're giving you an extra power, thanks. Duties come with it. Expectations come with it. A lifetime of service comes with it. A lifetime of anxiety comes with it for a lot of people, right? Expectations to be fulfilled. And if they're not fulfilled, a man is not living up to his foreordained potential. Why do we ask one gender to make additional promises to God in order to get back to him? Is it rooted in the Adam and Eve story? Is it something about our gender that's deficient? Why is it a prerequisite for all of the other exalting ordinances? If life without the priest is good enough for the advancement of women to heaven, why not for men? And if men can advance without the priesthood, why can they not be given at least the choice to opt out and be a perfectly valiant, diligent disciple of Christ, just like we see throughout the New Testament and the Book of Mormon? Those guys are going to heaven, and they weren't priests, right? Sorry. Consider our own duties of the priesthood going back to 1830. What was the charge of a teacher and deacon? To watch over the church always, be with them and strengthen them. See that there is no iniquity in the church, no hardness with each other, nor no lying. See the church meets together often, warn, exhort, expound, and teach. There's not a single thing on that list that a woman can't and doesn't do. And they're deacons and teachers. Because the ordinances, the administration of the sacrament and priesthood doesn't come up until you're made a priest. And yet it's clear in the early church, it's clear in the New Testament that if you were a teacher and deacon, you were being ordained to the priesthood, an office in the priesthood. These are all things that we expect women to do in the church. Teacher and priest in the Book of Mormon, preach repentance and remission of sins. We send out sister missionaries without the priesthood to do that exact thing, and they're successful. Some would argue more successful than men. I mean, anecdotally, I think that's true. It's not until you're a priest that you can minister the sacrament. So can women not watch? Can they not strengthen? Can they not preach without the priesthood? In other words, can they not act in the capacity of the ordination of a teacher? And don't they already? Is this just literally nomenclature and labeling? If so, can't we have a big chunk of men do the same? They're headed to heaven. They're righteous. They're doing all this stuff. The big difference is in ordinance performance and presiding over congregations. And Margaret Toscano, distinguishes between kind of an inner priesthood and an outer priesthood. I like to call it a soft and a hard priesthood. Look, let's reserve hard priesthood for ordinances, for presiding, for congregations. And then we can still suffer in a patriarchy or whatever, where everybody leads a congregation as a man. But everybody else is in the same boat. You're not solving the whole problem, right? But what if a man neither needs to perform ordinances nor preside over a congregation? I don't need to. The predicament we're in is that we can say that only men are deserving of the priesthood. That's unpalatable in 2021. We don't want that. But in order to avoid it, we backed ourselves into a corner to explain, well, then why do only men have it? Could there be a place for men without the priesthood in the LDS Church? I'm not asking the question whether there could be a place for women with the priesthood in the LDS Church. This is a separate question. They could teach, they could watch, they could possess the gifts and powers of the Spirit, they could serve a mission, they could receive their endowment and promises, right, of exaltation. They could even be sealed to their spouse. How do I know this is possible? Because they could be like LDS women. Right? I mean, why don't we ever say, I just want to be like an LDS woman? Yeah, I'm about up. Okay. So the last part, there's two approaches, right? And this is the choice that the Supreme Court had. They could do away with the draft completely, or they could admit women. And I think that's the position we're in. There's two ways to come at this. And I think a lot of women want into the draft. And I think if you were to corner me and ask for my position, it's let's just do away with the draft. It doesn't solve the whole problem, but it solves, I think, a lot of the theological ones. Thank you. Questions? Yeah. You want to come up? I don't know if the mic's gonna. We have the majority of people are attending from online, so if you could speak into the microphone. And what time are we ending? 20 after? Okay.
Hi. So the question I had was, like, in this model, let's say we take away the draft, what does it look like with kind of our whole system of lay clergy, right? Where it's kind of the revolving callings, and one guy is, in his core meetings was a bishop and now isn't, does it kind of go to the system of mainstream Christianity where it's just kind of like this man holds the priesthood and is the pastor, is the priest, or does it, do we still have this revolving system, or does that go away?
So Dana, I want to make clear that I'm actually not proposing a system or solution because it needs to be worked out.
Right.
But
I guess what would be your opinion?
Yeah,
to how that would work?
I do have an opinion.
Okay, cool.
If we get away, if we back away from the conferral issue, and that we're ordaining people to the office, and they act under the stead of their office, apparently like they did for the first several decades of the church, it's going to look exactly like bishops do today. You're a bishop for 5 years. And when you step down, guess what? You're not. And when people like Elder Oaks get really hung up on the keys, it's all about keys and who possesses the keys. Well, at any time, who possesses keys in a ward? A deacon's quorum president, a teacher's quorum president, the bishop as the priest quorum president, and the elders quorum. Under the ordination of their office. I think that would be a simple fix, right? You're a bishop for 5 years, and when you hang up the keys or pass them on, you're just not a bishop anymore. Because apparently, according to President Nelson and President Oaks, we all operate under the power and authority of God, or at least women do. So I'm just saying, let men in their off periods, operate under the same power and authority of God that women have. I don't think it would be impossible, right? I mean, I don't think it would take very much. Yeah.
I'm wondering if I had the right words to put this into words, but I know the question has been sort of rhetorical, and I guess I'm just wondering if it's really just is it like a sneaky, but not so sneaky, like a tongue-in-cheek kind of way to say literally what's different about the genders and forcing the church to have to say there's something different about the genders? Because if there is no something special about men's bodies and women's bodies, then we open it up for gay marriage, transgender, all these types of things.
But you saw Oakes brought that up, right, in his paragraph, a fear of homogenizing the genders and making marriage.
Right, and you said
confusing.
he doesn't answer it, but in other talks, people answer it all the time about women's bodies and men's bodies being different and us having different roles and all this kind of stuff. So I guess it's just, I love the concept of it. I guess I'm just saying it would all be very simply answered if you were probably to talk to the first presidency. They would say like men are born a certain way and that's how God is, and God has the priesthood, so we need it, or something like that. So I understand theologically there's not a precedent, but would they need to just come right out and say, we believe, we just have to continue in 2021 saying there are differences about the physical nature of these bodies?
Yeah, and I guess I would like your answer to your own question. I do kind of believe in sex. If we reduce it to gonads, I mean, there's something there. It may not apply to every circumstance, but I do think there's a difference. I think there's an evolutionary difference in the sexes. They haven't put their finger on what that is, though. Because if you're saying it really is gonads, and we're talking about biology, you haven't explained theologically why somebody needs and I don't say this flippantly because I'm a believer, right? I'm a participant in the church. I don't say this flippantly, but it kind of feels like there's a sense of a magic cloak. Like the priesthood is a magic power, right, that men put on and carry with them. And they can, go invisible or whatever at any given moment. Why is it that that's tied to gender? Even if you believe only women can bear children, that men are stronger, more, whatever, I'm not going to go through the list, but that there are genders in the sexes. What is it about that cape that only belongs to one?
But if you do that, do you have to say gay people could get married? Because is it the same argument? I can't tell if it's the same argument or not.
I don't think it has to be. I mean, I think they're related issues, like gender essentialism is related. Like, is this because he believes, Elder Oakes I'm talking about, he believes that it's an eternal, the proclamation of the family, it says it's an eternal characteristic, right? I don't think you have to. And if you wanted to save this approach from devastation and the slippery slope, I think you could say, no, I mean, we can still hold on to that. We can still hold on to, I mean, one of the talks that I had read in preparation for this was, I believe it's Harold B. Lee has a statement about how women without the priesthood cannot be exalted and men without womanhood cannot be exalted, or something like that. You could still believe in this yin yang, right? Where it required a little bit of both, if that was your theology. But they refused to make it explicit. Like, I wanted to explain. You just make the assertion. And that's not doing me any good. You're running me in circles. It's a tautology. I ask, what is it about the genders? And you tell me, but the genders are different. Well, what is it? What about the differences specifically requires the priesthood for one and not the other? And you say, but the genders are different. I'm like, what wheel are we caught in here? So I'm just challenging them to make it explicit. Break it down for me, for the stupid among us, right? Break it down for me. What is gendered about this power and authority of God, the ordination? Probably one more question. And Dan, I thought you had a bunch.
I do, but
Yeah.
now comments first.
Okay.
Take a while.
So I have a few questions.
Okay.
So one of them is, do you feel I love this concept. Do you feel that with just ordaining those who are in that office, do you personally feel that women should be allowed to be in those offices like Bishop Rick? Love this idea. Second, have you pitched your ideas to any of the higher ups? Do any higher ups know? And third, do you have any sense of any desire by men to not have the priesthood? Because it would go against their ability to continue to be in the patriarchy.
Yeah.
Unless it's as you suggested.
Yeah.
And then just a comment, it struck me this week at Symposium that if we have this beautiful doctrine about a heavenly father and heavenly mother, but wouldn't one think that in order to be a goddess, you would need the priesthood?
Well, you
Like,
do, I think. Yeah, I'm sure
But
that's,
I mean,
yeah.
so those are my two questions.
So let me take them in reverse order. I've been shopping this for a few years and to men. And men who are in the church largely don't care about this. It doesn't resonate, okay? It's not the language they speak. It takes too long to explain. It's difficult to get them what I'm talking about. So I don't know that there's a real appetite for opting out. I believe anecdotally there is. And it's a whole nother presentation that actually I kind of did in Boise a few months ago to a small group. I don't think the church works for most men. It works very well for some. And those are the ones that we see in the church. For most men, the church is not really designed for manhood. Personally, I think it goes a little bit back to Christopherson's talk. Because I think there are cultural differences in how men and women interact and what their expectations are. But that's beside the point. Two, going to higher ups, I don't really care about higher ups. They're going to do what they're going to do. They don't care what I think. They're not interested. I really don't believe they're interested in developing sophisticated theology. So why throw a gauntlet if it's going to, fall on deaf ears? Number one, if you're just asking for my personal opinion, without making it explicit, I hope I've left the message that I believe women are entirely as capable as men to do all of these things that they're asking them to do. And to cut off half of our available leadership is to cut off our nose to spite our face. And if we had an understanding along this line that we would allow those who are best positioned to serve through the ordination of an office, knowing that all of us as disciples possess the power and authority of God, I personally think that would be the best church. Whoever it is, right? The best person. Not best, not merit-based, but like the best positioned, right? The person that a congregation needs at that moment for whatever reason. So. We're the last session, so I guess they'll let us go. Can you step up to the mic? Sorry, Lacey. Oh, is there?
By the
Okay.
time my third son was going through the 11-year-old ordination process, I had like a visceral reaction of angst about it.
To his ordination.
Yes,
Mhm.
to the point that I resisted and I couldn't put the language or understanding of why, other than, me personally, some frustration I have with patriarchy. But I think you put language to it for me. As a woman, the choice for ordination is removed from me. It's not a choice I'm ever given,
That's right.
but we're doing the same thing to our boys.
That's right.
And so that reaction, I think, was equal to the feeling I have for myself that I have for my child at 11 that doesn't understand the implication of his priesthood ordination. So this to me was brilliant.
So my response.
No, I don't even have a question. I just think it was so smart and helped me understand myself and my position in the priesthood and why I have such a frustration with it for my boys.
And that's why I wanted to use the language of conscription, because I think if we believe in agency, if we believe in the power of self-determination and progress, men, it's foisted on them. They're just drafted. And I don't know if that always feels the case, but given the fact that ordination is mandatory in the church along with baptism, at the time of baptism, whether you're an adult convert or not, you're conscripted to it, and it's part of the package. And the only way that you can get out of it is to pull a Muhammad Ali, right? And to be a conscientious objector. And you know what we do to conscientious objectors? We send them to prison.
And frankly, the agency is removed, in my opinion, from the woman.
Yeah.
And the agency is removed from the
removed.
boy. So
That's
they're
right.
equal in the other child.
In that aspect, that
Yeah.
was the point of my presentation.
So good.
So thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it. One more
Well, there's some
question.
here. You wanna take them or write-
I'll take them. I mean,
You kind of answered.
my experience, Community of Christ is men do better without priesthood. They feel more comfortable serving without the pressure of priesthood. Doesn't this make sense? Yes. Will the leadership say women have the priesthood when they are in the temple, or they have the power of the priest in the temple? Where does the temple come into your presentation? You know, I really don't want, I mean, I tried to unpack what the leadership says. I don't know what they're saying. And I think you're going to get different opinions and different explanations. We have no clear theology about it. It's clear that they're promised to be priestesses. It's clear that they are administering Melchizedek priesthood ordinances in the temple. It's clear that they are anointing people. Those things don't get done in our church without the priesthood. So I think there would at least be an admission to that. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.